Can you believe it? You're already hearing me again on your radio. You've heard a lot of me, haven't you? And before you heard me, you probably didn't believe there was an education like this on menopause. Not only that, you probably weren't even aware that you needed an education on menopause. And now that you started attending what I call Menopause University, you're probably shocked at how much you've learned and how much you had all wrong before getting this education. Am I right? So, I'm Menopause Taylor. I am the menopause educator, and I bring you this podcast called The State of Menopause in the World Today, and I teach you how to manage your menopause your way. So, before discovering this podcast, if someone had said to you, there's so much to learn about menopause, and it's possible for you to easily understand all of it, you might have said, I'll believe it when I see it. Have you ever heard anyone say that before? Have you ever said that before? People say that a lot. Well, the title of this podcast is I'll Believe It When I See It. Anytime a person hasn't experienced something firsthand, they'll say, I'll believe it when I see it. If someone says something they don't believe, they'll say, I'll believe it when I see it. If someone predicts something that has never happened before, they'll say, I'll believe it when I see it. If they hear a fact that is contrary to their own position on an issue, they'll say, I'll believe it when I see it. And if someone promises something that they don't expect to materialize, they'll say, I'll believe it when I see it. So the comment, I'll believe it when I see it, is really, really common. And it's not only a common form of speech, it's also a common way of thinking. If you've ever heard, thought, or said, I'll believe it when I see it, you need to listen to this podcast. And that's because I'm going to teach you how that way of thinking can get you into a lot of trouble when it comes to menopause. In psychology, this way of thinking is called the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is when you believe anecdotes, testimonials, and individual dramatic stories more than you believe actual statistics. And you use these familiar situations to make decisions rather than using actual statistics. For example, if I teach you that heart attacks are the biggest killer of menopausal women, and that women should worry more about heart attacks than breast cancer, and you respond with, but I know 3 women who have had breast cancer and none who have had a heart attack, that would be a perfect example of the availability heuristic. In essence, you're saying that until more of your friends, your little circle of friends, suffer or die from a heart attack, you will refuse to shift your focus from breast cancer to heart attacks. And in fact, that very example happens all the time. And that's because women who have heart attacks typically die, and the ones who have breast cancer live to tell you about it. So the common mistake is assuming that breast cancer is one of the more important things about menopause, and that it's of more concern than heart attacks simply because you've had more firsthand experience with it. As I've taught you in many of these podcasts, heart attack is by far the more significant risk at menopause than breast cancer for the vast, vast majority of women. Yet, most women refuse to believe that. They apply the I'll believe it when I see it principle. So both the availability heuristic and the I'll believe it when I see it comment are examples of believing something that is more commonplace if you can find just one single example of it in your own circle of acquaintances. And you are far less likely to believe something that you've never heard, seen, or witnessed firsthand before. But you know, what's so odd about this is that statistics take into account whole populations of data. So let's see. You probably know maybe 100, maybe even 200 women. And when you use only those 1 to 200 women to determine the greatest risks at menopause, not only is your sample size really small, it's also fairly homogeneous. I mean, the mere fact that the women you know probably live near you, probably have something in common with you, or have the same lifestyle as you, is enough to make the sample fairly homogeneous. But population statistics take into account the entire population of women. Millions and millions, even billions of women. So why in the world would you ignore data based on billions of women and use your 100 or 200 acquaintances instead? I know I've mentioned this tendency to substitute statistics for your own experience in previous podcasts, but it creates such a big impediment for so many women that I just needed to make a podcast dedicated specifically to it. Now, of course, we're all products of our own personal experience, and I mean, it's only natural to focus most heavily on the things that affect you personally. So if you yourself have had breast cancer, of course, obviously, you're going to view it as a bigger threat than a heart attack. And if you've already had breast cancer, then it is a bigger threat. I'm not in any way belittling your difficult suffering of breast cancer. If you have already had a disease, of course it's your biggest risk. And of course, you should weigh it more heavily than any statistic based on the entire population. But in situations when you merely know someone who has had breast cancer, unless that person is someone who directly increases your risk based on genetics, it does not warrant ignoring statistics. So if your own mother or your own sister with the same mother or your own daughter has had breast cancer, then your risk is higher than average. But if it's a relative other than those 3 maternal first-degree relatives, your risk is no higher than average. And if the acquaintance who has had breast cancer is merely a friend, then it bears no significance for your risk at all. And unfortunately, this is the most common instance in which the availability heuristic overshadows statistics. In the last podcast, I talked about how fear can induce you to assess information emotionally rather than logically. And the "I'll believe it when I see it" comment and way of thinking is often fear-based. When fear is involved, it takes a lot more data to convince you of something. And even when there is convincing data, fear is likely to win you over. Fear interferes with your ability to consider things rationally. So, I have told you before that I don't care how you manage your menopause. I'm here to help you manage it any way you want to manage it. This whole education is about empowering you to manage it your way. But I think it's important for you to know why you choose one thing over another. It's important to know why you believe one thing more than another. The key is to distinguish what's making you respond one way or another to information. No one has to know your motivations but you. It's the difference between using your heart and your head to make decisions. I mean, is it what you feel that determines your decision? Or is it actual factual knowledge that determines your decision? Just don't do something for the wrong reasons. That's like putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. So the next time you hear someone say, I'll believe it when I see it, just stop and think about whether or not it's appropriate. Because I don't want you putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And it just so happens that in the world of menopause, most women focus on all the wrong things. And the problem is that they suffer as a result of putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. You know, I've realized that I'm really old. Because I have seen the world change so much in my lifetime in terms of the way people go about things. And I think this whole I'll believe it when I see it mentality is very well aligned with people's personal opinions about things. And it turns out that people have personal opinions about things about which they have no real knowledge at all. And I say I'm old because when I was growing up, my father was a military man, and he had his own ways of thinking and doing things, and he ran a very kind of strict and tidy household. And I remember when I was a kid, my father would say to us, you aren't entitled to an opinion until you have an education. And you know what? He was right. Because the truth is, until you have an education, you don't have the tools with which to form a valid opinion. I mean, you don't really know what you're talking about. You don't know how to think through a situation. You don't know how to come up with an opinion. But the weirdest thing is that nowadays, everybody's got an opinion, whether they have any education or not. And I find it so shocking that people are all giving their opinions and spouting off about this or that, when in fact they have absolutely no expertise on the topic on which they're giving the opinion. I mean, it just strikes me as so odd. And I find myself, scratching my head thinking, why is it that people who have no expertise at all on a topic are telling others what to do on something for which they have no expertise? And I'm even more shocked at the fact that people are so gullible that they listen to them. So this whole idea of having an opinion and deciding that you'll believe when you see it, when in fact you don't have any experience or education in the first place, really seems odd to me. It's one of those things that is so backward and upside down, and I see it all the time and every day. I answer the comments on my YouTube channel every single day, all of them, and every now and then I get a comment from a woman after, I've taught a lesson and given statistics on this or that and told facts about something, and the woman will respond with what I talked about today here in this podcast, and she'll say, well, I know. My most recent comment said, I know millions of women who've had this and this and this, but not this. And of course, I'm very diplomatic in my response. And I said, well, one of the biggest mistakes people make is they counter statistics by citing what they've seen in their own lives, in their own circle of friends. And I said, frankly, I doubt that you have millions of friends. You probably have maybe even 200. The average number of relationships that most humans have is about 150. Studies have shown that that's about as many as we can keep up with. But I said, hey, maybe you even have about 200, maybe even 300. I don't know. Maybe you're really, really, really social. But even if what you've seen in that circle of 300 people tells you one thing, why in the world would you substitute that as your fund of knowledge and use it as the basis on which